Hi there.
Hello, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. No, that's fine. That's fine. I was just thinking, it looks like I can share the screen. Host disabled participant sheet
Oh
screen
yeah,
share.
I can.
I think there's something you can do to change
Yes.
my status or something.
You can share. I think. Okay. All right. I think you can share.
All right, perfect. Let me try again. Yay. Okay, might take me a while to. It's got all my old files on it. I hate when it does that.
Oh, they all show up on the screen. Yes. Nice to meet you, by the way.
Very nice to meet you too. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Uh,
We should have. I'm surprised that we're only 10 minutes away and we don't have. I should be getting a flurry of phone calls from people unable to get in because that always happens.
oh yeah.
And
There's always something, isn't there? That's weird. I can't find my file now. Maybe I need to open it in oh, here we are. All right, wait. For some reason I can't find it. Right, hold on. Maybe if I minimize it, if I open it and minimize it, it will see it. I don't normally have that trouble. It normally lets you look in your own files and retrieve the document. Hold on, won't be long.
I wonder if there's something about the parameters of my sharing that's not letting you.
I'm not sure, but I think possibly it seems to like remembering stuff that's already open. So let's see. Okay, I'll try again. Now, I think that's weird. Dropbox Zoom. Why is it asking me to go to Zoom? Oh, that's a bit funny. So weird. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for checking in. We were just having a little bit of technical stuff that we will get through. We always do.
Oh, I think I've got it now. All right.
Oh, very good.
Does it come up?
Yes, we can see it. I can see it. Can anybody else see it?
Can you see it now? Okay, that should be all right then. I'll just stop sharing. I just wanted to make sure that I could bring it up at all.
Okay. Good,
yeah,
good,
I got it now. Yeah.
We have just a few minutes before we get started. So, you know what I thought was really interesting to read about in your book, that there are 300 properties in the National Trust. I mean, we have a lot in the United States, but a lot of them are sort of parklands, historic houses administered. And of course, we have a lot bigger territory. And it was like, oh my God, if you went there and you made it a point to see them, it could take you almost a lifetime to see all these.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many. It's a really large organization. It's got nearly 6 million members. So it's a massive heritage organization.
That's wild. Yeah. I don't think we have, well, I guess I don't know. I don't know how many the National Trust here in this country has, or the National Park Service. But I bet proportionally it's not as many. And I felt like I found that when I went to France a few years ago, that there's a lot of, it started under de Gaulle, right? There's a lot of sort of state support behind the preservation of these places, behind historic preservation itself. And you don't really get that in the United States. quite so much.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because a lot of our English heritage and historic England properties have government funded, they're state funded as well. Because
Yeah.
it's different. The National Trust is a charity and it's funded by subscribers.
Oh, the National Trust is entirely a charity. Oh.
Yeah, yeah. That was part of the reason why we had so much trouble when we put that report out. But I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome, everybody. We're waiting for a few more folks to sign in, and we will be underway shortly. We have about 30 people signed up for the talk, which I think is a great number. We'll get a good discussion out of this. And a good question and answer session. And, you know, thanks for staying up late.
Oh, I know, yeah, because everybody, it's 10 o'clock at night here.
Yeah, we were struggling with like what would be a good time, and really Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock here is, you know, we kind of figured we would not be getting a whole lot of people because everybody wants to go out and, you know, party, but that's okay. The diehards are with us.
The truly committed ones. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Lori. Lori and Dorothy Clark, who will be signing in a few minutes. Dorothy, I know, is familiar with your work. And I think Lori is too.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to let you know, Dorothy unfortunately had something come up, so she won't be able to join us. She just texted me.
Okay. Waiting for just a few more.
Hello everyone.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah. Sorry.
Welcome to our newcomers checking in. We'll be underway in a few minutes. Just so everybody knows, I think you knew this when you checked in, but we are recording this meeting. We've had a few folks ask if we could share the recording afterwards. So I think you have to give that permission when you sign in. Mr. Lewis. Hello. Susie Buchanan, Shirley-Eustis house. How did you find out about us? You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Rachel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it was via friend sent me the link. Thought sounded interesting.
Not, I'm sorry, Lewis, so it's not you. I was
Oh,
looking for Mr. Lewis, Mr. Chip Lewis. Hello. Oh, you're muted, Mr. Lewis. Your volume's down. Let's go to Suzette. You're muted too.
Be muted. I got the mail, the email from Loring Greenhouse.
Oh, terrific. Okay, great.
And we've just been to visit Monticello, and so this is and done a lot of reading. So this is very interesting.
Oh, good to know. Good to know the benefits of co-sponsorship, I guess, right?
Okay, so I think my speaker might be working now.
Oh, we can hear you. Yes.
Very good. I'm a member of the Loring Greeno house, and actually I'm from the Greeno family that used to own the house.
Oh, welcome. That's
And
great.
I was going to send a question: do you know whether there were any slaves that were at the Loring Greeno House?
I can answer that quickly while we're waiting. Hi, Chip. I'm Lori Conlon. I'm one of the co-presidents at the Loring Greeno House. And yes, there were enslaved people at the Loring Greeno House during the Loring's time. And we are currently trying to do research on who they were. We do know of one gentleman who then his status in the census reports changed from being an enslaved person to being an indentured servant.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so we're doing a little bit more research then on hopefully him and seeing if we can find anything.
What dates would that have been?
That would have been in the 1760s.
Okay.
And the Greenos got the house in 1783.
After the revolution.
And,
Yes.
and I've never found in any correspondence or any stuff that I've looked at, I've never found any reference to any, but I'm just curious.
Right, and that's that's the same year that slavery was abolished in Massachusetts,
Okay.
1783. Yeah. Great, there's more people arriving.
Yes, hello, everybody, welcome. So we're at 5:01, so I think as we'll just continue to let people in, and we'll go ahead and get started with an introduction and get going, because I think we're going to have a lot of questions for Corinne. I just want to give us a little bit of background and first sort of welcome everybody to this presentation with Corinne Fowler. I'm Susie Buchanan, Executive Director of the Shirley-Eustis House here in Roxbury. And I want to thank the Loring Greeno House in Jamaica Plain, particularly Lori Conlon, who's with us tonight, and Dorothy Clark and Sarah Coyne, who were enthusiastic in their willingness to co-sponsor this event and to publicize it. And I want to thank Rachel Hoyle, who was our Shirley Place's 2021-2022 academic intern. And Rachel did a lot of work in coordinating this event and getting it going tonight. And then, of course, we'd like to thank Corinne for agreeing to give us a talk across oceans and time zones at a time when you would probably rather be in bed, Corinne. So thank you, everybody. We here at Shirley Place were interested in hearing from Corinne because our site is itself a relic of the British Empire. It's a Palladian mansion built in 1747 by British Royal Governor William Shirley as a country seat, just like the ones he had known as a young man growing up in the countryside south of London, and like so many of which are preserved today by Britain's National Trust. And Shirley, like so many men of his class, enslaved several African people to support the genteel lifestyle of living that he felt was his due, and on some level his duty as a representative of the empire. Corinne is here tonight to help us get a broader perspective on how we, as house museum professionals, scholars, interpreters, just fans of historic houses, can go about making public the histories of enslaved people and people of color in historic houses in the US and in the UK. In her work as a faculty member at the University of Leicester and as director of Colonial Countryside National Trust Houses Reinterpreted, Corinne has been an agent of change for the way Britain's National Trust houses tell their histories. And she has also dealt with the backlash from those who fear the discomforts of an anti-racist perspective on the past. So tonight she'll share some of that history with us, and she'll also discuss her book, Green Unpleasant Land, which looks at the ways artists and writers of color in the UK have reinserted themselves and reinterpreted the areas of Black history from which they had, sort of previously been written out. We recognize that we have a long way to go in creating equitable cultural institutions in the US. You just have to look at the recent controversy at Montpelier, President James Madison's house, to see how the backlash against these efforts isn't unique to the UK. And so I hope the discussion tonight prompts some creative thinking about how we can continue framing our histories in a way that not only embraces the full history of our region in New England and our nation, but also offers ideas and clues as to how we as preservationists can actively shape a more just and equitable society through our work. I know that goes against the grain for a lot of us. We'd like to just work in our little historic houses and tell our little stories, but we need to sort of, meet the challenge that we face today. After Corinne's talk, Rachel is going to follow up with a few questions that we think will really round out the discussion. And following that, we'd love to take your questions as time permits. But so that we don't distract from Corinne's talk, I would ask that you you can enter your questions into the chat, but just hold them until we get into that section of the evening's discussion. And so before I turn the talk over to Corinne, I would actually like to dedicate this evening's event to the memories of those enslaved people who lived here at Shirley Place in the 18th century. And there were many. Their names, so far that we know them, are Jack, Jane, David, Thomas Scipio, Affie, Nanny, Caesar, Hannah, and Peter. And with that, we'll let Corinne go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to attempt to put my PowerPoint up. Hopefully it'll work. Yeah, I think so. There's some kind people nodding. I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about myself, actually, and why I'm here in this place talking to you about this topic and how that happened. When I went to school as a child, I learned very little about British colonial history. In fact, I didn't understand really much about the British Empire until I went to university. And I learned a lot about the Tudors, the kings and queens of England, but I didn't learn very much at all about different kinds of colonial activity, which were so formative of Britain, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so I kind of went on a big, long journey and spent many years studying this. And I became more and more drawn to the history of British country houses. And I've got this image here because it really kind of evokes the really pleasing side and the aesthetics of country houses in Britain. The idea of Arcadia, the idea of something soothing, something away from the city, away from the hustle and bustle, and also the feeling of the pastoral, that kind of sense of well-being that people often experience when they go to places like National Trust properties, which are a series. National Trust is a massive member organisation. It's got nearly 6 million members. It's huge. And people go there at a weekend often. They might walk their dogs there. They might have a cream tea there with jam and scones and all that, and a cup of tea, and go around the houses. And it's a very important and established experience in British life. But I think, obviously there's a lot more to the history of National Trust properties, and there are many, many more historic houses, but the National Trust alone has got 300 of these places. It's absolutely huge organisation all over the country. But a lot of the history was missing from the explanation of the house's history. So what visitors were learning when they were going to these places was completely devoid, almost completely devoid of references to colonial history, even when that was centrally relevant to the history of those houses. And so I devised a project called Colonial Countryside, which I worked with 100 school pupils all over the country. I connected them up to their local National Trust house, which in many cases was a good 50-minute bus ride away for these pupils. They were 10 years old. And as I say, there were 100 of them. They learned about the history of each house, its unique colonial history, because they're all different, all unique. And they looked through the houses and they produced poems and short personal essays in response to that. And I'll show you some of the work that they did later on. I also commissioned creative writing. I worked with a team of historians who were experts in different ones of the country houses. The pupils did things like give guided tours to people to highlight the colonial elements of the houses. And they also gave talks. This is some of the pupils giving talks at the British Museum annual conference. I asked if I could bring them along, and they explained what the history meant to them, what it meant to them personally. The child on the right-hand side is a particularly amazing example of how inspiring she found this work, because she went to one of the country houses called Charcote Park, and she saw a miniature portrait of Tipu Sultan, who was, of course, a really important leader in Indian history. And she thought, because she's of Indian heritage, she said, why is this in this country house? She was puzzled by it. So she went and researched Tipu Sultan. She went and researched the British Empire, all independently. She quizzed her parents about it. She quizzed her Indian relatives about it over Zoom and stuff like that. And she asked her parents to take her to India to see Tipu Sultan's summer palace. So they took her to India. And she, in this British Museum conference, she was explaining that she has noticed that British historians are all obsessed with the history of Tipu Sultan and the East India Company. The taxi driver who drove herself and her parents to Tipu Sultan's summer palace thought that Tipu Sultan was a villain because he believed in Modi's government, and he thought, didn't like the Muslim history of India. All nations have their repressed histories. And yet the Muslim curator was absolutely thought he was a hero because he developed the infrastructure of India and the silk industry in particular, as well as roads and other kinds of infrastructure. So it's really important to think not just what the history is, but what it means to people, to different people, and how they might connect with that history. But the best thing of all was that she then spoke to the National Trust and suggested that they made a connection with the Tipu Sultan's summer palace, which they then did. And she was very proud of herself. She said, I'm only 10 years old and I've negotiated an international partnership. So, this is what, this is the sort of impressive level of engagement that I found these pupils had. And they said this is history, but this is interesting history. This means something to me because it's resonant for them. 1 in 6 pupils is connected to former British colonies. So you have to think about the next generation, not just the older generations. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. So as referred to at the beginning of the talk, what I then did, because colonial countryside was so powerful and so compelling for people inside the National Trust and the leadership of the National Trust also, they asked me to come and work with them on finding ways to talk to visitors about colonial history attached to each site. And as part of that work, I did an audit of peer-reviewed academic research about National Trust houses. So this was any stuff that had been produced over the last 20 years. And we found by doing that audit that 1/3 of all National Trust properties had really quite significant and often multiple connections to the British Empire. And that could be, it's not just slavery and the slavery business, but a connection to having African and Indian servants in those houses or gardeners. It was connections to the East India Company. Many of the people who owned those places were colonial governors and so on. These are sort of wildly different, whole range of, across the historical periods, whole range of colonial connections. The reason this was necessary was because, as I've said before, the National Trust didn't really talk about this history. And I'll show you some examples of houses that they own where the history is really so relevant. It's obviously a kind of sin of omission not to, a kind of a dereliction of duty for a curator not to speak about this history. Here are some examples. So Speke Hall is near Liverpool, which was one of the main slave ports in the world at one point. And Speke Hall doesn't look like it has anything to do with slavery because it's a Tudor house. But it was only ever owned by two families, the Norris family and the Watt family. The Norris family built a dock which allowed Liverpool to enter the slave trading business really enthusiastically as it did, and to become a really important port. And then the Richard Watt I started off as a hackney carriage driver. He went over as a young man to Jamaica, and he became involved in every aspect of the slavery business. So he owned plantations, he sold on enslaved people, he managed people's plantations, he had a shipping business of exotic wood, rum and sugar, which of course were produced in the plantations, and brought them back to Liverpool. And he also invested in slave ships. There are many ways in which he earned his money. He came back with an awful lot of money, and as many people who made their money through empire did, he bought a country house on the edge of Liverpool in a nice green pleasant part near the river. And this is one example. Now that money was then passed sideways along the family because he didn't have any children, but all the people who inherited it inherited the money, and they spent that restoring this house and then passed it on to the National Trust. So we wouldn't have this house if it wasn't for the slavery business. So it's a really, really important aspect of that place's history. Another one is in Wales, Penrhyn Castle. And Penrhyn Castle, you can see it's this huge, potentially ugly, you might say, kind of mock Gothic building. But this was built entirely with the profits of the Clarendon sugar plantations in Jamaica. And also money from the local quarry, but the local slate quarry was, and this is how kind of working histories combine with colonial history, this quarry was invested in and developed in the first place with money from the Jamaican sugar plantations. So even though it went on to make 5 times more money, without that initial investment, it would never have been possible to make so much money from it. So again, incredibly, this was never mentioned really before 2007 during a small exhibition of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade by an historian, Marion Gwynn, who's been studying this history for about 25 years of this castle. So with the colonial countryside pupils, we did an exhibition there, which is still there now, called What a World. And they picked 10 objects from the house and they produced poems, and mostly poems and short narratives about it. They worked with a poet. And you can go around, look at those objects. And one of them did a brilliant poem. It's only 3 lines. And the poem was talking about Lord Penrhyn, who owned the sugar plantations. He had money. I had history. His money bought my history, which is a really thought-provoking poem, an amazing thing for a 10-year-old pupil to produce. I mentioned that I would show you some of the work that the pupils did. Now, this is an example of a kind of painting that is very commonly found in British country houses. And I imagine you've got an equivalent in the US as well. If you look very closely at this painting, it's actually from the year 1680. So it's very early, and it's Captain Thomas Lucy with an unidentified enslaved page boy. it's hanging in the house. It didn't have any information about it, but this painting is very important because it's opened up a whole history of the Black presence and the African presence in that region of Britain, in rural Warwickshire. And if you look at the painting, I've tried to magnify it a little bit so you can see the boy at the edge of the painting. The pupils were really drawn to this painting because they were 10 years old and they felt this boy was a similar age to them. And so they were very curious about who he was, and they were very keen to look in the records and discover more and to learn what other historians had found. I love going through archives with pupils because they ask different questions of the archive first. They come at it from a different angle, and that's why I really believe, and this is a kind of a hint for how to research these histories. I think it is really important to have as diverse a group of people in terms of class, life experience, race, gender, disability, because all of those people bring different things to the table. They ask different questions to the archive, as I've said. So what the pupils did was that they asked if they could rewrite the guidebook and incorporate the history of this various colonial objects, including this painting. And they commissioned an artist to do some work for them. They told the artist exactly what they wanted. They told him what they wanted, where, how he had to draw it, what style, what colors, everything. And he just did everything they asked. And so this is just one of the pages, which I've stuck a little label on at the top. So they wanted to use a cartoon character to show visitors the painting and around the house, just to make a kind of logical progression through the house. And so they wanted to highlight the boy at the edge of the painting. So they asked the artist if he could get this child sort of sticking out of the side so that it could draw attention to his position at the edge of the painting. And this is what they wrote. This is their words, word for word. This is their commentary on the Godfrey Kneller painting that I've showed you from 1680. He didn't choose to come to Chalcot. He was brought here by Captain Lucy. If you look at his neck, he is wearing a slave collar. He is probably the same boy who served hot chocolate to the captain's wife. We think that the boy is called Will Archers because there is a church record at about that time. His real name is unknown. This was probably a name that was given to him. People are interested in this picture because it tells a new story about this area of the country, that Black people were living here in the 17th and 18th centuries. So they've completely kind of reinterpreted that painting, really thinking about what it means to them and what interests them about that painting. I mentioned that I commissioned some creative writing about these country houses that we were working with. We were working with 10 country houses. And this is the poem, which was produced by the commission poet, an adult this time, about this page boy. And the title of the poem is They Have Named Me Page. A word they use for the flimsy things inside the leather bindings they call books that fill the shelves in a room they call a library. When they brought me here, the strange sounds that passed between them were like stones falling on my head until I learned to look for meanings. Now I can match their words to concrete things and even read emotions in the foreign language of their faces. But I will not let my tongue curl around the sound of them. Silence is my refuge. I have the lock and key. I'll not open the door. Some pages may offer words. This page is silent. And the reason I commissioned writing to go with this is that these histories mean something. They're sensitive histories. They've got very powerful human dimensions, and it's important to acknowledge that and to honour the kind of absent presences of people like this page. There are some, as I say, 300 paintings like this in British country houses. I imagine you have many yourselves. So now to just deal a little bit with the reaction to this work. I mean, the work was very gentle and sensitively done, and it had a very powerful and evidence base, but which is very important, by the way. But at the moment in Britain, and I imagine you can identify with this, there's it triggers a lot of emotions, this history. So there's trauma on one side of the history, and there is a kind of historical denial and a defensiveness or hostility on the other. And so obviously it takes a great deal of kind of compassion and wisdom to steer your way through this without making the toxic discussion worse. You want to reach people, connect with them. You don't want to alienate anybody, and it takes a lot of thinking and reflection. And the way in Britain that this history tends to get looked at is that most people haven't really learned a great deal about this history at school, so it feels unfamiliar. It almost feels made up. But as I say, this is evidence-based work. This is rigorous academic work. And it tends to get viewed through a prism of guilt and shame, which is not necessarily very helpful, because obviously more knowledge about the collective past and the shared histories of the many people that make up modern Britain is better than less knowledge, right? I know that sounds self-evident, but you wouldn't think so with the response we had. And one of the discussions that we have is, which I think is very unhelpful and doesn't progress historical understanding at all, is was the British Empire all bad? What were the good things about empire and what were the bad things about empire? So it's sort of looking at everything through a kind of value judgment, and as if you can kind of draw up a table on one side or the other. But the point is really that who gets to decide, you know, what was good and what was bad? And also, is it really advancing historical knowledge? You know, colonial history, the history of the British Empire is extremely complex, multi-layered, multi-phased. It's just not really very helpful way of looking at it. The National Trust, as I say, is a massive organisation, and when the National Trust released the report that I co-edited, there was a massive reaction. I mean, we knew it would be difficult, but it's hard to describe how massive this reaction was, and it went on for a year. And what happened was that in the British Parliament, you can see in the picture on the left-hand side there, a government minister called Jacob Rees-Mogg attacked the National Trust and the National Trust report and said it was denigrating history, British history. And in particular, it was denigrating the memory of the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, because there is a house which belongs to the National Trust, where Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, lived. And it mentions in the National Trust report that he was colonial secretary. That's pretty much all it says, but you know, anyway, this was the reaction. And it just got worse and worse and worse. So I got really badly dragged into it. I was the only academic external to the National Trust co-editor of this report. And there were lots of articles which really, really worried me. So, for example, at the bottom left-hand side there, you can see it says, this is the Times, a fairly respectable newspaper, National Trust accused of bias in study of colonial history. I mean, this is just an evidence-based, peer-reviewed report, audit of peer-reviewed research. So by really prestigious historians. So, I mean, it was really alarming, the idea that this was some kind of bias rather than just one of the many hundreds of reports that are produced all the time for the National Trust. And then on the top there, you can see the Mail Online, which has got massive readership. National Trust is accused of recruiting biased team of academics, that's me and my colleagues, to probe its properties, links to empire and the slave trade. So obviously this is really worrying because it could potentially inflict reputational damage on myself and my colleagues, and we kind of earned our good reputations for, very honestly. So you can see also there were pictures taken off my Facebook page. You know, there's a picture taken from my Facebook page with a bird on my head. And there was an article in the Telegraph in pink there, which is another kind of major newspaper. It was an opinion piece, and the opinion pieces are the real problem because they're presented as news, but they're actually opinion pieces. I've read the National Trust report, and it's a one-sided take on history full of woke prejudices. And I question the intellectual heft of its editors. Now, if you look at the report, it's just an audit describing what the evidence is at the moment. It doesn't pass judgment. It doesn't pass comment. It's just really quite a straight audit. So it's been caricatured as something that it's not. So obviously this was quite a troubling time. Every time there were these articles, I got loads of hate mail. I also got loads of support mail and death threats, and also the police got involved. My phone was hacked. Yeah, it was really, really a difficult time. And my response was not to run away, although my university kind of told me to run away. I felt it was very important to hold the line, to use the platform to make the case for doing this work and to explain in a reasonable and respectful way why it was necessary, why it was timely, how it was put together, and I did that, and I kind of used that platform and eventually managed to turn the situation around. And what I found was that although the newspapers were very hostile, the data was telling us something very different about National Trust members and the British public. So a survey in around this time, I think it was at the end of 2020, found that 78% of people thought that the National Trust should talk about its colonial history. And subsequent reports have shown that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of National Trust members, of which there are many, think that it's the right thing to do. So what you have is a very powerful but tiny group of, it was about 4 or 5 people who were causing all the trouble with very big platforms, who have loud voices. And to be honest, it feels a bit like a juggernaut coming at you on the pavement. You have every right to be there, but there's this great big thing driving towards you, and you don't have the same platform to defend yourself. But eventually I did manage to persuade some of the journalists. I actually reasoned with them individually to, provide a right of reply and to also give me a column and things like that. And that worked really, really well. So I'm fine. It was a masterclass in everything. So I would do it all over again. It was well worth it. What I learned a lot about was the culture war. And I believe that a lot of these things are quite relevant to yourselves and your own situation. So in Britain, the main people who were attacking the National Trust and myself were a group of 59 actually, cabinet ministers and Conservative MPs called the Common Sense Group. They were also columnists who were writing columns, but people took them as news. So, opinion pieces, which are really, really difficult to deal with. And they were nearly always older men. And there's a kind of pattern of attacking academics of colour and female academics as well across Europe, the US, Australia, and in Britain, because I got a lot of help from international security experts who were they came running to help me. Lots of people came running to help me because they realized an attack on one is an attack on all. And they told me these things. From their research, this is what they were finding. So one of the strategies is misinformation. So there's a kind of liberal use of inaccuracies, which is really frustrating because it's a lot of the time, the people who do it, I've realized that they're not doing it because they're evil people. They're doing it because either it's a good story, it sounds like a good story. So so for example, they one journalist went to find my book, and there's a chapter on it about gardening, and in that chapter I make connections between the transportation of plants and the routes which were used by colonial vessels, and I show all the connections between colonial networks and the bringing in of all kinds of exotic plants to the UK. that made the headline in the Daily Mail. Woke professor says gardening is racist. I mean, it makes a great headline, but it's kind of absolutely crazy. And so obviously this is really difficult, because I got the usual hate mail and "you stupid woman," blah 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 from people, but actually all I was doing was drawing on a wide range of research to show the relationship between colonial networks and not just gardening, but plants and the importation of plants, nurseries, the establishment of nurseries and those businesses and so on. So this is one of the problems that we encountered, and some of the tactics that are used are actually, I've realized, used again not because people are evil, but or they want to behave badly. It's just that they genuinely believe, some of them, that the history of Britain is under attack and that they are defending it in some kind of noble way. So this is why it's important to understand the motivations of people who attack you. And in fact, I used to reply to my hate mail, and it was extremely educational. People would write me hate mail, and they would be swearing at me, calling me all kinds of stuff. And I would reply respectfully, authentically, respectfully, because I really wanted to know how they came to that opinion, how they reached that opinion. And what I found was that when I explained to them my position and I showed them the evidence, within about 3 emails, they were wishing me well. So that tells you something, because it's really, really important not to dismiss people. If somebody talks to me about engineering, I'm not going to know anything about engineering. So it's really important that I use any knowledge I have as a resource, not to weaponize it or make people feel belittled in any way. But people have to start from somewhere. But there is a tactic to kind of denigrate people, to dismiss their work, create a them and us dynamic, which I think is really important not to play into unconsciously. There was a lot of backroom intimidation. So those MPs came and talked to my funders and tried to cut off my funding and stuff like that. This kind of thing. I mean, obviously they weren't successful because my funding was completely legitimate, and my funders were very proud of the work that I'd done. They also tend to exploit the education gap, where you've got people who might have left school quite early and feel insecure in the area of ideas and articulating ideas and so on. And they also pretty much endangered the, I don't know if you have this in the US, but there's an arm's length principle where if the government is funding a heritage organisation or a museum, they're supposed to keep a distance and not politicise things. So they're supposed to give those museums autonomy, but this government hasn't done that. They've come and sat on the, they've kind of got involved in appointments of trustees and got people pushed off, trustees pushed off boards and things like that. So in Britain, sort of when I end this, I do want to sort of talk about the connections between the culture war in the US and the culture war in the UK. I mean, very much this is a symptom of populism, populist politics, where there's a perceived threat and a perceived defense of that perceived threat, which is all plays into this dynamic. And there is, it is very much associated with, as I put there, the rise of nationalism in Australia, Europe, and the US. I've already mentioned the kind of targets, but some of the concepts are cancel culture, which obviously that it's really important to interrogate that, because I've never felt so cancelled in my life. I wasn't cancelling anyone. And free speech. So in the name of free speech or defense of free speech, certain people are shut down. And it's important not to play into that as well, I think, on any side. And also the idea that history is being rewritten because it's unfamiliar, and because it feels unfamiliar, it's somehow being fabricated. And that's really, really important. And that's why research rigor is so absolutely critical to support any interpretation work that's done in heritage sites. So I talk about my existing book, and I've kind of touched on some of the themes, but I sort of want to just briefly touch on the book I'm writing at the moment about it's called The Countryside, 10 Walks Through Colonial Britain. And what I'm doing is I'm walking through 10 different regions of Britain, in Scotland, in Wales, and in England, with people who have ancestral connections to empire, to talk about what the unique histories of each region of Britain are and what they mean at a human level. And here are two of the people that I walked with. There's Graham Campbell on the right-hand side. He's a kind of local politician in Scotland, and he is connected to the history of Jamaica. He doesn't know his own family history because it's kind of been erased by the slavery history, and that's a really big issue for him. And Charlotte Williams walking through Wales to explore the history of wool, because the woolen material made in mid-Wales was sold primarily to plantation owners across the Americas. So it's looking at all those unique histories and how what the landscape means to the people that I'm walking with. And here's one of the ones that I walked with, who's also quoted in my book, Peter Carlew. And I asked him what the countryside meant to him. And this was his answer, absolutely typical of him. The African continent was robbed, and the fingerprints of the English countryside are all over the crime scene. No amount of warm beer, nuns on bicycles and thatched roofs, which is how a previous Prime Minister described the countryside, can obscure that. So I always keep my hand on my wallet when I hit the green hills. So he's really sort of capturing that ambivalence that he feels towards the countryside. Even though he's written about it so much, he still feels very visible. There is a sense in which he feels that white people feel perhaps more comfortable, more like they naturally belong, despite the very strong and old history of African and Indian presence in the countryside in Britain. This is where he and I walked to. It's a tiny little port called Whitehaven in the northwest of England. And you can see by looking at the harbour that it's got two parts to the harbour. And that history is generally told as a history of coal, that there are coal seams all along that coast. And the ships used to sail from that little harbour, the inner harbour there, out to Dublin in Ireland. And when those captains of those ships were sailing across that route, they realised that that route was gave perfect access to the Americas, because you could avoid all the enemy Spanish and French ships. And so they built that outer harbour to accommodate the transatlantic ships, and it became the 5th largest slave trading port, but it was also a massive importer of tobacco, the 3rd biggest importer of tobacco from Maryland and other places in the US, Virginia, mostly Maryland, for a long time. This is why this whole port sprung up around that business, around that tobacco business, and also secondary industries like snuff works and ironworks and other things which were funded by that tobacco and slavery wealth. And in the this is another example of the countryside and the strong history of the African and sometimes Indian presence in the British countryside. This is a list of 61 people. I've only showed you the beginning and end of the list of all of the African and Indian servants and enslaved people who were brought over to that port in the space of 120 years. That's an awful lot of people, and it's an awful lot of stories we don't know. And there's always more work to do, and that's why I think it's important to bring in members of the community, because they're very motivated to learn about local history. And if you look at colonial history through a local history lens, it's a very useful thing to do. This here is an example of the National Trust, because the National Trust just doesn't just own houses, it owns pieces of land. It owns about 1/10 of the British coastline. So it's got a description here. I won't go through it all, but it's mostly focused on coal, and it doesn't mention the tobacco or the slave trading history. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the National Trust itself. It might have produced a report, but that was just the first step on a very, very long journey. Another person I've walked with in this time in the area of Dorset is Louisa Adjoa Parker. And she wrote a fascinating poem, which I talk about in my book, called, in her collection, How to Wear a Skin. And it's called, the poem is called Sometimes When I'm Making Beds, and I've just taken an excerpt from it. She is talking about a time when she worked in a little seaside port of Lyme Regis, where it's where John Fowles, the author's French Lieutenant's Woman, was filmed, if anyone's ever seen that film. And she said that when she was making these beds, she was conscious that she was the only brown-skinned person in the town at the time. And she was really conscious that she was kind of cleaning rooms for white tourists. And she started looking into the local history and the slavery history of the area. And there was indeed, in that southwest part of Britain, there's a very strong slavery connection. And she came up with these lines: I could be an African girl brought back 2 centuries ago. Oh, sorry, I was trying to move myself from Jamaican plantations by a trader, my master, his mulatto child, in fact. So I think it's really important to, again, understand what this history means, and to understand it in terms of legacies, and the fact that racism is a legacy of the British Empire. There's a very good essay by the writer Salman Rushdie called The New Empire in Britain, and he talks brilliantly about how you can't have 200 years of people white colonial white colonists sort of talking down to and subjugating people of colour and not come out untainted from that. He writes really clearly about it. Another example, which before I sort of come to an end, because it's quite hard to listen to online talks for that long, I think, that might interest you, is that this history here. It's a walk I went on recently to an area of Britain, really beautiful park called Hampshire, near the English Channel in the middle of the south of England. And this house belonged to Alexander Baring. And you may have heard of Baring's Bank and Baring Brothers and the collapse of Baring Bank and so on. But the Baring Brothers were really, really powerful. At one point, they were known as one of the 5 great powers of Europe, alongside Napoleon and others. And what Alexander Baring did before he bought this house was that he negotiated and helped negotiate as a banker the Louisiana Purchase, which, as you know, doubled the size of the US, and was this was where Napoleon sold all that land to from Mississippi upwards to the the US, so it became, you know, sort of doubled its landmass. And Bering made a massive commission on that. He got he bought government bonds from the US, and he bought them at 87% of their value, and then he sold them on and made a profit. And he also made commission from that sale, and he made about $1 million from that in old money. and this was one of the houses that he bought. So but you also know that obviously the Louisiana Purchase extended the geography of enslavement across the southern states. So it's really, really significant. He also owned enslaved people in some of the Dutch Caribbean islands as well. And he was a member of parliament, but he did call himself in parliament, I've checked all the records, he called himself a sincere abolitionist, which is kind of a difficult circle to square. But I collaborated with this great academic called Ibrahim Asek, who you might have heard of. Some of you may have heard of him. He is from Senegal, and he came on an exchange visit to Louisiana. Louisiana. He came to New Orleans. As a teacher. And when he was on this exchange visit, he visited a museum and he heard an old blues song, and he said, "Hang on, that's Senegalese." And it took him off on a whole research journey, and he went to a talk about with the origins of people who were enslaved in Mississippi region and just beyond New Orleans. And he realized that they were from the old ancient region called Senegambia, which was between the river Senegal and the river Gambia. And he just set off on this massive research journey. He did a PhD, and he is now the official researcher for Whitney Plantation here, which they describe as the only museum in Louisiana with an exclusive focus on the lives of enslaved people. And I'm sure that some of you have been. But he was going to walk with me, but he didn't get a visa yet from the British government, so I have to do the walk all over again. But I think it's a really good example of the need to collaborate with African researchers, with researchers across continents, because his perspective on Louisiana is absolutely fascinating. You know, he says that he's done a whole load of research into the influence of the legacy that was left in terms of the influence on Louisianan culture, Louisianan food, Louisianan stories. You know, Brer Rabbit. You know, rabbits. The story is from Senegambia. The different animal stories that are told, the expressions and their origins in slavery, also the food, the influence of Senegalese food, couscous, and so on. He talks about all of that in his book. Just coming to an end now, I wanted to mention that I do have a free course online that you can do called Country Houses in the British Empire. And it does talk a little bit about how to retrieve the histories of Africans and Indians who were in the British countryside and in these country houses and so on. It says you have to pay on that free frame, but actually it should be a free course, and it's running again in October, and it'll be free in October. I just wanted to mention that, you know, I've talked about culture war, so I want to finish off by actually thinking about Martin Luther King a little bit in relation to the culture war, because I started recently, just out of interest, reading all his sermons, and there's this great collection of his sermons called A Gift of Love. And what struck me by reading them now at this particular moment is that he describes the culture war almost exactly. And he also talks about strategies for dealing with it. in a great deal of detail. And I found this really useful and enlightening because, as I say, my experience of culture war, kind of when I found myself in the middle of a major news story, was that there were the ways of dealing with it, and were the best way of dealing with it was the kind of ways that he was suggesting. But it also struck me that a lot of this is still the unfinished business of slavery, working its way out. It's an unresolved thing. And in the UK context, there's a particular brand of historical denial about the British Empire and what it actually entailed. So I just wanted to read something and just finish off by reading just 2 short excerpts from his work. I mean, one thing he says, just before your eyes sort of glaze over on that text, is that he explains that he quotes from the Bible, and he talks about, you know, be ye wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And I thought it's really fascinating concept. He does a whole sermon about it, and he talks about the difference between soft-mindedness and tender-mindedness, tough-mindedness, because tough-minded people proceed from the evidence. They kind of look at the evidence and then they form their conclusions. Soft-mindedness is something which is a problem, but it's very prevalent, and it's something that it's useful to understand. But he also talks about how tough-mindedness, independent critical thinking, is not in itself enough. You also need tender-heartedness, hence the reference to snakes and doves. You need that kind of apparent contradiction in terms to deal with this without contributing to the toxicity. And this is his description of the connection between soft-mindedness and racial prejudice. He said soft-mindedness is one of the best basic causes of race prejudice. The tough-minded person always examines the facts before he reaches conclusions. In short, he post-judges. The tender-minded person reaches a conclusion before he has examined the facts. In short, he prejudges and is prejudiced. So many politicians in the South recognize this disease of soft-mindedness, which engulfs their constituency. With insidious zeal, they make inflammatory statements and disseminate distortions and half-truths which arouse abnormal fears and morbid antipathies within the minds of uneducated and unprivileged whites, leaving them so confused that they're led to acts of meanness and violence which no normal person commits. It just really, really sounds familiar. And then he finally finishes off with this reference, which I think is just one word that I haven't mentioned so far, is courage. Because if you want to do this work, you do need courage, you need commitment, you need to understand that any attack on you is not personal, that it's not your responsibility, but also that there is a rightness about it that goes way beyond your own personal importance. And that's why courage is required in order to progress this kind of necessary and beneficial work. And he said, many people fear nothing more terribly than to take a position which stands out sharply and clearly from the prevailing opinion. The tendency of most is to adopt a view that is so ambiguous that it will include everything. And then he mentions, you know, this kind of failure of courage, which is so kind of prevalent even today. Many sincere white people in the South privately oppose segregation and discrimination, but they are apprehensive lest they be publicly condemned. So I think I really found it very illuminating reading Martin Luther King's sermons again at this time, and I'll kind of finish you off with that.
Thank you, Corinne. That was full of insight. Rachel has a few questions that we thought might help round out the discussion. And then if anybody has questions that they want to start uploading to the chat, we can sort of move to that. So if you want to take over, Rachel. we'll
Sure,
open it
yeah.
up.
Hi, Corinne. That was so excellent. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Yeah, I have a list of about like 20 questions that I could ask you right now, but I'll limit myself. So again, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I guess based on what you talked about, probably my first question would be, what advice would you give to a historic site that's thinking of opening up its history to examine its colonial roots for the first time, maybe? As someone who's been through the experience of dealing with this cultural backlash and of responding to people who are upset about this, what would be your 1 to 2 first points of advice to a site that wants to look at its colonial history?
Well, I've got a number of things. Number one, make sure that your leadership is on board, that they're not going to throw you under a bus, that they are fully committed to the work. They're going to see it through as a long process, and they're genuinely committed, not jumping on some bandwagon. That's really important. So you might need a bit of culture change. Secondly, it's really important to work with people of colour also who have a good, strong track record of doing work in the field, who have expertise. And I wouldn't suggest working with one person of colour, because that's very exposing. And I would kind of try to really transform things. For example, I was talking to a museum in the UK, which was noticed that it had all white trustees and it wanted to explore its colonial history. And I said, well, how many spaces have you got on your board? And they said, well, we change around quite frequently. We've got 3 spaces. So I said, well, find 3 experienced people of colour and bring them all on. Then, you're sort of, there's sort of safety in numbers, and it would just transform things much more quickly. So that's another thing. Make sure you've got a really, really strong evidence base, that it's not, that the work is rigorous, that it's peer reviewed, that it's checked very carefully, because that's your shield when things get difficult, because this history is more open to challenge than almost any other. Not because it's controversial to academics, but because it's controversial to the general public. And the other thing that I would suggest is something I was hinting at before about bring together the most diverse group of people that you can around local history and discovering these colonial connections or slavery connections through a local history lens, because people are very motivated from all walks of life, all ages, to learn these things and even to research the archive together. So training is obviously extremely important. And I've done lots of training with heritage volunteers who tend to be disproportionately white compared to the rest of the British population, disproportionately older and disproportionately rural. But the vast majority, I've worked with about 600 of them, and the vast majority are really stimulated by it. They find it a kind of awakening. It's not something negative for them at all. They didn't realise it. It does need dealing with sensitively, because you have to acknowledge the emotional side. You need to do it in an emotionally intelligent way, because sometimes learning this history means that you might need to change your worldview a little bit. And that's what learning's about, and that's why it's also stimulating with the right kind of support.
Yeah, thank you.
I think commissioning is a really important part of interpretation, because you have to understand the human dimensions of that history. And so as poetry and music and film, they're all really helpful ways of interpreting the history in ways that are respectful. It's just it's all about respect. You will make mistakes. We all make mistakes all the time, and fear is one of the biggest obstacles to doing this work. You have to just commit yourself to making mistakes and be respectful at all, and learn what you need to learn as you go along, and don't let that stop you, because that nervousness about it is what stops people doing it, and that's not going to help anybody.
Yeah, yeah, and that ties back so well to what you said about just communicating with people, like how you just talk to people who disagreed with you and
Yeah.
approach them as humans rather than an opponent of some kind.
Absolutely, and it also it's useful strategy. It's not just about being respectful and all that. It provides extremely useful information about how somebody could come to think what they think. It then suggests a kind of approach that would assist a person like that to connect with the information, because you can present information till the cows come home, but it's getting people to connect with that information that is the true gift, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, and art plays a big role in that, in getting people to feel new, to consider new ideas and feel new things that maybe they haven't before.
Yeah.
And actually on that topic, I have been reading Green Unpleasant Land, and I really liked in your intro, I'm not sure how many of our viewers have gotten a chance to read it, but the title of that book refers to, I believe, a Blake poem that then became a popular lyric in the song Jerusalem. And I was astonished that you wrote about like how many artists and politicians and people of all walks of life refer back to this one lyric about the green, pleasant land. So why do you think that lyric in particular has such a hold on like the idea of the British countryside?
Oh, because especially with with Britishness, but with Englishness in particular, the countryside is perceived to be at the kind of soul of Englishness, and it's where the old ways of life reside, and the old pleasant ways of life reside, as well as the hardships of life. And so it's not merely that, it's just that the William Blake's poem was made into an anthem, and that a song, and that song is considered by many to be the true English anthem. And it's got that line in it about England's green and pleasant land. And so obviously when I wrote the title of that, my title, Green Unpleasant Land, I didn't know I was going to be in the middle of a major news story, so it didn't really help, you know, when that book came out and they said, oh, see, you don't need to read her book, she hates her country. But you know, anybody reading my book realizes how much I love the British countryside, and find, you know, a lot of stimulation from looking at all those different levels of meaning behind it and its connections to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that actually, as a clueless American, that was the first time I'd ever listened to the song Jerusalem, which, like you said, is considered like an English anthem. So I learned something there.
It actually it does kind of work as an English anthem, because William Blake appeals to radicals on the left, but the anthem and the tune appeal to the more conservative. So actually everyone likes it, you know, on both sides. So it is potentially quite a unifying song, but in a weird kind of way.
Yeah. All right, sorry, I'm looking through all my questions. So in your book, you reference a lot of Black and Asian literature on the countryside to like deconstruct this idea that people of color belong in urban areas. And I really loved the references you made to that literature about people of color, like reclaiming their connection to nature and to the countryside. So did you approach the work of colonizers or English people differently than you approached the work of people of color, even though both are connected to the countryside?
Well, funnily enough, it's partly because I've got a background in literature as well as history, and I was increasingly aware, that since the 1980s, there'd been a kind of rural turn in writing by, it's kind of a rural return, if you like, of writing by British Black and British Asian writers. And so I just kind of followed where the literature read, really, and I noticed that in the 1980s it was just making fairly tenuous connections. So V.S. Naipaul was making fairly not tenuous connections, tentative, sorry, that's the word. Sorry, it's a bit late here. It's like 11 o'clock at night. Was making these sort of general connections between the Caribbean and Britain. But then as time went on, and as historical investigation carried on, there was more of a dialogue between writers and historians who were opening up the colonial history of the countryside. And I kind of then went back to the more established literature of Britain, the kind of the rural pastoral tradition of writing over a number of centuries. And that's how I kind of brought it all together and showed that the writing by people of colour was really very much in continuity with and in dialogue with that old pastoral tradition. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I went with it, really.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love that aspect of your book a lot, that connection. So for my last question, I thought I'd end on a more positive note, and then we can open it up to everyone here. But my last question is referencing the kids that you worked with in the Colonial Countrysides project who were 10 years old. I was definitely not thinking that deeply when I was 10 years old. But do those students that you worked with give you hope for the future of British historic houses, and as well as views on British colonial history?
Oh yeah, I mean, completely. They're in such a different place than earlier generations, including my own. They're just not having it. I mean, they just don't get the culture war at all. It's completely irrelevant to them. One of them said, and I think I finished my book with a quotation from one of them. She said, well, you can avoid this history if you want to, but you can't stop me studying it. And, that's kind of the general attitude, I think. So yeah, I mean those pupils are not from a tradition of denying British history. I mean, I might believe and know that the British education system isn't doing a great service to British colonial history in terms of informing the next generation about that history. But although teachers are very keen to do that, the curriculum, which we have a national curriculum, doesn't really help them do that. But they think differently because they are so much more connected to the world through their family connections, but also digitally. So it's not really possible to think in that parochial way anymore. It's just not even possible.
Thank you. Yeah, I loved, that must have been so great to work with them.
It was, yeah.
Like
yeah.
they were so wise.
They were brilliant, and it was actually them. This is why it's about hearts and minds, because you can't just provide the information. It was those pupils just moved people. There's nothing more moving than seeing 10-year-olds absolutely enthused about history and also passionate about the case for studying that history. So
just to follow up on that, there's a couple of sort of theorists of museums in the US, Richard Deerking and Lynn Falk, and they talk about the way we learn outside of schools, and how, you know, there's this whole world, especially in the world of historic tourism, it's called informal learning, right? And a lot of very successful informal learning happens when kids go to places of informal learning, like historic houses, like museums, like outdoor parks, where, especially if they're with their families, you know, there's a different mindset that you go to these places with, and you are often more receptive to what you're going to learn, and what kind of information you're going to receive. And so I think that is something that, you know, we in the field can keep in mind, because we're always sort of, you know, worried about whether we're relevant, but, you know, what visitors take away with them when they come to a place like the Shirley-Eustis house is invaluable. You know, you're just adding another little sort of bit, another little building block in a different way to tell our history, that builds up to a lifetime of changing that. And so, to your point, children are so receptive to that, and it's delightful when they can engage.
I don't know if you have the same situation in the US, but in Britain, there's a certain cohort, a fairly limited cohort of pupils who visit museums and heritage sites. And so none of those children that I worked with would traditionally be part of that cohort that goes to visit those sites, not least because they feel kind of uncomfortably visible in those places, because there's, you know, they feel very conscious of their brown skins in those places because they're a visible minority or a minoritized group. And so one of the things that fascinated me was that after the National Trust report was published, there was a big surge in membership of the National Trust. It attracted they had 5.5 million members. They've now got just under 6 million members in the space of a year. There were people joining just because they thought, oh, finally, these places are suddenly interesting. And oh, maybe they're relevant to a person like me, with a history like me. And I think it's also about sort of thinking about how to bring in people who wouldn't traditionally go to those museums, in addition to completely agreeing with your point.
Monticello saw a 16% increase in visitation by people of color after they leaned into the story of enslavement there. So, and they consider that an unqualified success.
Yeah, that's
so yeah.
Still, it's a really good increase. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So other than so we do have a question from Mimi. She wondered if any of your projects encountered any negative reception from communities of color.
No, because they were led by children of color. It was a child-led history and project, so they led it. I kind of assisted them through the process, and it had a large number of Black historians, and all of the commission writers were Black. So I think people realised that it was a genuinely inclusive project, and I didn't get any problem from people of colour. I just got problem with older white people and politicians and newspaper editors.
I was very interested. So I read the report as, preparing for this talk. And like you said, the report is very, very mild, right? It's just sort of some data. And it was just amazing to see that it would cause such a ruckus.
Yeah.
But the report also made me wonder if you, and maybe we can finish off with this, you know, there are these wonderful portraits that show enslaved people and sometimes not enslaved people in these houses. Has there been progress made that you know of in finding out the identities of some of, I mean, I know some of them are known, but many of them, you know, people are still trying to figure out who these people are, which is an issue that we face here too, is finding out the identities of some of these people. Is anybody making any progress?
Yeah. There's a group led by Miranda Kaufman, who wrote a book called Black Tudors, and she's got a whole bunch of experts on portraits together. They're putting together a big database of those portraits, and obviously the point has long been made that art historians basically ignored the black sitters in those paintings, as you're saying, and only followed the history of the white sitters. And so obviously that's a massive sort of unconscious bias, should we say. And it's quite difficult to trace those individuals. But the example I gave is a good example of a success there, because a local Black history group went to the archives and they found not just the probable parish record for that page boy and a kind of a secondary piece of evidence of a letter which showed that the mistress of the house at the time used to be served hot chocolate by an African page. But they found lots and lots of other records in the whole region, and it kind of opened up a history of those presences. And in week 5 of that free course that I'm doing, that I mentioned earlier, we talk about evidence for how to trace these sorts of presences across parish records, in graveyards, and then in escaped slave notices, which we've got databases for now. There are a lot of new databases which you can trace people across the archives sometimes. And there's a new book just out by someone who's a US historian, and it's about Restoration England and escaped enslaved people, or people who made a bid for freedom in Restoration London, and he did manage to trace some of them across the archives. He's done a whole book about it, and he found that they were mostly young, mostly men, and they had a lot of things in common. These people who made these bids for freedom. So yeah, there's a lot of really good work going on, but obviously this is why I think you need these mass research projects. As long as you have checks and balances and peer review built in, it's a really, really efficient way of combing through the archives and matching tracing people across the records.
Right. And so we're just at the beginning. We're just scratching the surface now. Yes.
Yeah, but it's all possible, and it's a great prospect. It's very
exciting. Well, thank you so much for staying up late for us. It was just great to have you, and I hope we can have a chance to chat again sometime. And thank you everybody who's attended. Thank you to the Lauren Greenough folks. And do check in with us if you have any questions afterwards. You can just email me. I put my email in the chat, or just reach out to us here at the Shirley-Eustis House. And we will look forward to seeing you all later on site this summer. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. I'm going to sign up for your course right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.